hitting record right now, but and actually, is it Jill or Juliet here?
It's Jill.
Jill, got it. There's a little bit of a backstory to that, but I want to welcome you to the show, and I'll kind of have you give the introduction and a little bit of the backstory in your what I'm going to say expertise, because I just started actually read a book. I'm talking about it on the podcast this week called Being Mortal, Medicine and What Really Matters in the End. And it's like I've experienced death and dying from the perspective of, people who are listening, you lose loved ones or you see someone passes away, but it's not something that's talked about. And you're someone who actually taught me about death and dying a lot, like formally. And that came through some volunteer work that we'll talk about. But before we get into that, just give a little bit of background of, who you are, where you're at in your life, and what led you to kind of do the type of work that you did in which you and I met.
Sure. So I'm retired right now. I retired from being the volunteer coordinator for a hospice. And what drove me to hospice was the fact that both of my parents actually used hospice. And so about 25 years ago, my mom developed a brain tumor and went through about 6 months of life after diagnosis. And during that time, we did have hospice in. And I thought, what an incredible group of people to be able to walk through the most difficult time for the person and for the family. So they were just as supportive for the family as they were for my mom. And then 15 years later, my father developed cancer, and he actually died in a hospital because it came on so quickly. But hospice came into the hospital as well. And so when I became a caregiver, the next step was to go into hospice. And I saw this job for volunteer coordinator. I thought that's ideal for me, especially being able to share my passion with helping people through that process. So that's how I came into hospice.
And it's such an uncomfortable, and when I say uncomfortable, I mean like for example, my wife said, "Why are you reading that book?" It's not a happy book. It's not, a friend of mine she's a nurse, and I'm not sure if she's still working in the pediatric area, like where kids are dying from diseases and cancer. And it's such a hard thing to live with. So for you, like, it was that drive, it was your experience with your parents in hospice that drove you to want to be a part of it. But talk a little bit about kind of maybe the not aura, but the view of hospice, the view of death and dying, this kind of like elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about, but everyone has to deal with. When you first got into it, were you already comfortable with it through your personal experience, or did it take you a while? Were you taught about how you taught me? It's like, were you taught that from other people?
No, I was very comfortable with it from the very beginning, just because I think honestly my relationship with God helps me to face death, knowing where I'm going to go. Watching my mom go through death. When she originally was diagnosed, I prayed, Lord, please let me be with her when she dies, because I want to be with her. Then when the tumor would swell, she would go through such excruciating pain. And I was like, Lord, don't let me be with her when she dies. I can't handle that. And so the whole time during that 6 months, I was back and forth, back and forth. And when she did finally give her last breath, I was with her. And it was the most beautiful experience. I was so thankful that I was able to be with her. So I think that right there was the thing that really took any kind of fear or the unknown, I think, took that away from me right there.
With the book being, have you ever heard of the book Being Mortal?
No.
Okay, so and I don't know if you still are up to date or you would have any interest in reading it, but it's a really good book. And his perspective is more of a bird's eye view of we need to improve this. We need to improve the process of death and dying, because he goes back in history and stating the fact that we used to, as people, a couple hundred years ago, not live that long. Now we live really long, and we're kind of lagging in developing our, not only for how am I going to live when I'm older, when I'm alone, but like how are we treating those who are really sick and dying? And, one of the things that really, COVID has done a lot of things to a lot of people. And when I was reading the book, and actually what prompted me to read the book was thinking of people dying alone because of COVID. And it got me thinking, and this doesn't have, I don't want this to turn into a political conversation, but it got me starting to think like, okay, well, wait, if people are flying in airplanes, why can't people be with their loved ones when they're dying? Like, it really confused me, and it just angered me, to be honest. So when you think of COVID and you think of people dying alone, from your experiences and knowing how important it was for you to be with your mom and how important it is for the sick person to be with their loved ones, what do you make of that? What do you think of it, and how do you process it?
Well, it's interesting because there are some people that would choose to die alone. When we look at death, it is important for us to be able to help those that are passing, because many of them, when they come to the end, will have unfinished business. And if there aren't people around to help them to finish that business, whatever that business is, those people will die an excruciating death because they've got that thing that's not being accomplished. But then there are people who will. I had a friend whose father was dying. She was with him for 3 days solid. Didn't take a bath. Finally, she was like, you know what? I need to go take a shower. She went and took a shower, and her father passed. He didn't want to pass in front of her. So there was that idea that there are some people who do want to be alone. But then I said, there are others that have unfinished business, that they need people to be with them. And it's so ultra important. And I think the idea of being with someone who is dying with COVID, I think that's got to be a personal choice, that if somebody wants to go in and be with that person, if they're masked and if they're taking their precautions, I just think it's cruel not to allow people.
Yeah, and that's news to me. And why? So why would I read this book? Well, because I learned things. Asking that question to you presented that fact. I never realized that some people do want to die alone. So it better equips you to deal with this stuff in the future. And then one of the things you said, unfinished business. When I was talking to my wife, trying to explain the book and the points of it, and I would explain, in the book he talks about this fact that, if you're on, your last several months, or there's things that are important to you, and she was like, well, like what type of stuff? And it was hard for me to articulate, for some people it is simply, I don't want to feel pain. For another example was the guy just wanted to be able to eat ice cream and watch football. That was his base, right? So when you talk about unfinished business, from experience and or just knowledge, so for someone listening thinking, well, what's unfinished business? What are some examples of that?
Sure. So I can give you a very personal view of one, which was my mother. She went into a coma. She was in a coma for about 10 days. And during that time, hospice was helping my dad through it and said, have you said goodbye to her? And he said, no, I haven't done that. So he went in that day that he got that instruction and went in and said goodbye to her. And at that point, the dying process started to begin, which you can see there are physical things that happen while somebody is passing. There are definitely the body starts to shut down, and there are some signs that you can definitely watch for. So we called the whole family in. My brothers came, and a couple of my nieces and nephews, and stood around the bed, and we sang songs, and we were just with her. And it got to be about 12 o'clock, and my brothers had to drive pretty far, so they left, and it was just my dad and I. And while I was sitting there with my mom, it suddenly dawned on me, her mom was still living, and she was the sole caregiver to her mother. And I realized that I had to commit myself to care for my grandmother. And I promised her, I said, I will take care of Nana. I will, I'll never do the job that you can do, but believe me, I will be there for her. I will do everything in my power that I can for her. It wasn't probably about 5 minutes later, she gave up her last breath and died. She just needed to know that somebody was going to take care of her mom. So that's a very personal story.
Yeah. And go ahead.
And so kind of a funny story with my dad. So we were in the hospital, same thing. He had gone into a coma, but his coma was much shorter lived. And so they called me at the hospital and I went in and I was with him and I called my family and my brother. We had a whole room full of people. His mom, his stepmom was there, a couple of his sisters, my brother, my daughter was there, large group of us. And we were standing around and same thing, we were singing, we were reading scriptures to him, and he was just hanging on. And then they brought in what they call a bereavement trays for the family. So it has soda and cookies and crackers because we've been there for a little while. And same thing, suddenly it dawned on me and I said, you know what? Dad loves this gathering. He's not going to go anywhere because he loves us all being together. Yeah. And I said, and the thing was, my dad used to love skits. He used to love for us to like make up skits and do skits. And so I said to him, I said to my brother, I said, he's probably waiting for us to start a skit. My brother, who hated doing skits, said to my dad, if you think we're doing skits, we're not. He breathed his last breath and he was gone. Oh. And we were sort of like, do we laugh or do we cry? Because he had the last word here. So that was kind of a funny story. But other stories that I've heard and read about was a woman who was very concerned for her son who was overseas. And he came home and called her from the airport and said, I'll be there. I'll see you. Didn't need it, just needed to know that he was safe in the United States. One more for you was a story, interesting story about a father and daughter who, a very abusive father, extremely abusive. And when he was on his last, the nursing home called and said, your father's dying. And she said, no, there's no way I'm going to come. There's no way. And he kept hanging on as they called her back. And they said, I think he really needs to see you and finish whatever business. And so finally she agreed. She walked in. She was angry as anything, cursed him out and walked out the door. He passed. But I think it was more, he just needed to know that to let her voice that to him, and then he made his peace. So those are the kinds of things, usually maybe an unfinished relationship, an unfinished letter, so those are the kinds of things that people will need. And we see that in hospice all the time. And one of the things that volunteers are very good about doing is maybe writing that letter to a daughter or, trying to make that situation for them so they can pass.
And then, dedicating your life to it and having that be your occupation. And, talk a little bit about my volunteering. We went through, it was either 2 4-hour sessions or 2 8-hour sessions to familiarize me with hospice. And I thought, and do you remember, was it 2 4-hour sessions or 2 8-hour sessions?
4-hour sessions, right. Okay.
And I thought to myself, I just want to help here. What is there to learn? Right. And then I get there and it's like, oh my gosh, this is like, some of the it's one of those things that you think, maybe like finance or a checkbook, right? That's the old, like a checkbook should be taught to kids, like how to balance checkbook. I felt like that course on hospice is something everyone should go through because death is something everyone goes through, but no one actually talks about it, both like the practical stuff that we'll probably dive into a little bit, but also kind of the psychological and emotional stuff, the what to expect and how to handle and the range of emotions that everyone is going to feel and express. So for you, and we can get into some of that, but I'm curious, when I read this book and when I talk to you, I don't feel sad. I don't feel impending darkness coming over me. It's real. It's real. And let's talk about it. For you, was it hard to not being around it so much, talking about the process of death and dying so much? Was it hard to not let it cloud you and bring you down? Or did you find purpose and obviously you found purpose and meaning and you did it, but how did you kind of not let it, unless it did, stick to you all the time?
No, I definitely wouldn't say that I think it's a compartmental thing where you know that you're helping that person through, once again, the most difficult journey of their life. And you know that you're going to help them while they're alive. And then when they're dead, that gets set aside. I don't want to say that it takes a hard heart, because it definitely doesn't, because you need to have that compassion. But I think it's just learning how to close the book and say, that was for that person, that was that book, and now I'm going to read the next book, or I'm going to help the next person. And I think you learn to do that in hospice, where you know that you've helped them. And it's kind of when you're in hospice and you hang out with hospice people, there is a hospice humor. And so I think that helps a lot, just seeing that, as you said, death is something that we're all going to face. And it's something that we learn how to, as I said, compartmentalize it.
And so let's kind of get into a little bit. And, I don't still have the binder with me. I wish I did, now again, reading this book and having this conversation. But what are just some of the things, we spent 8 hours together. There was a group, probably 7 of us that spent 8 hours learning about, hospice and process of death and dying. So maybe pick 2 or 3 kind of areas or categories that you would start, like 101. Someone comes, they sit down. What's and as you talk, it will spur memories, and I'll be able to ask more questions about the stuff we learned. But what's a starting point or 2 for someone trying to understand the process of death and dying? And you can pick the practical, logistical side of it. You can pick the patient side of it. You can pick the kind of etiquette side of it. Any or all direction you want to take it. What are some of the paramount important things that we would have covered during that session?
The 2 that pop into my mind, which obviously I would think would be the most important if those are the 2 that are popping in my mind, is the actual physical things that people go through when they are passing, things to look for and what to do while that actually is happening. And then grief, the bereavement end of things is extremely important. It's as important for the person that the loved ones that are going through it as it is the person who's actually going through the death. So that bereavement process goes for both of those people. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's dive into the first part of that, the physical side of it, things to look for. I believe you said that hearing is the last thing to go.
It is. They believe it is the last thing to go.
So one of the things that I took from that, okay, if hearing is the last thing to go, whether you said it or I surmised it from something, it was, okay, well, let's not be talking in their completion when they're there and right. their heartbeat is going, because if it's the last thing to go, they can hear us. So let's understand. It's like, this is a lighter situation, but like the Zoom is on. Okay, the right. Zoom is on. So let's be aware that right. people are listening.
Exactly. And another thing is that when somebody is laying in bed, usually in a coma type situation, now not all people are in comas as they're passing, but that does seem to happen quite a bit. They are hearing. So you want to avoid arguments. You want to avoid, talking over the person, like you said, as if they're not there anymore. But including them in the conversation, including them and, even asking them, gee, do you remember when we went to the park, how much fun that was? And they're not going to answer you, or maybe they will, but, if they're in a coma, they're not going to answer you, but you're going to include them rather than talking over them. And I think that's one of the things that's very important. Also keeping things very calm and quiet are very important. A lot of times putting on their favorite type of music can help a lot. And just being aware of the conversation that's happening in the room. Because it is sometimes, we do tend to forget that that person's laying there, and then we'll get in a conversation, with somebody on the side. And that's not where that needs to happen.
Yeah. And then the grieving process, I talk a lot to young people and a lot about adversity and dealing with adversity and persevering and how do you do it. And one of the things I always say to them is I don't keep it in, right? I don't keep it in. I let it out. It's just like a tire's blowing up, boom, you hit the valve, like you just let all that out. Different, just as you alluded to earlier, it's an individual choice, and if it's out of the hands of the person that's dying, then it's the family choice. Like there's, circles that extend, and it becomes decision making. So each one is individual. There are people who are certainly less open and vulnerable than other people, but in your experiences with that grieving process, what have you seen? What are some recommendations? And then maybe even like, what are some surprises or anomalies that you've seen throughout that?
Well, there are the 5 basic areas of grief, which is depression, anger, guilt, bargaining, and acceptance. There's no particular order. There's no particular amount of time that anybody can go through one of those things. Everybody is individual. Some people, it can take years. Other people can go through in a month or so. One of the things you have to remember is that the person that is dying is going through that grieving process. So, if they're feeling depressed, talk to them about it. Be honest. If they know they're dying, we all know when we come to that place, we're not kidding anybody. If they're in that part where they're trying to bargain with God, if I just get this right, can you just heal me? If I just fix this up, will this make it go away? And it's a matter of just allowing that person to, like you said, talk them through it. And sometimes you can go through these processes and not know you're there. I know on a very personal note, when my daughter miscarried, a couple months after the miscarriage, she said, "Mom, I'm just so angry at everything," not realizing that was part of her grieving process. And so I explained that to her, that's part of the grieving process. And so if you've got somebody who's angry, let them be angry, because they're angry at what they're going through. And it's a matter of trying to step back and not take it personally. And the people that are around, those caregivers and those loved ones that are around that grieving person are also going through, we think of bereavement as the person's died, now they're going to start their bereavement. But I've seen many times loved ones going through that process before that loved one even dies, that it's already begun. So I know as a caregiver, I've walked through people through these stages. And I think anger to me is the one that I back away from the most, because I don't like anger. And so I have to allow people to vent that and disassociate myself from that anger that they're expressing, to putting it towards the situation as opposed to a personal.
Yeah. And you mentioned that the 5 stages there of grieving. I was automatically just thinking the person watching the person, like the person who's dying. I was thinking grieving of the surroundings. But is it generally going to the person first and then the surroundings, or is it everyone involved in the process? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yep. It's everybody involved in the process. It is. It's everybody, especially if you're going to be in a person that's going to walk into that situation. You can be aware of it for yourself. Be aware of the grieving process for yourself, and then be aware of the grieving process for others around you and for the person that's dying as well.
I think as I'm thinking through that, and I think I've talked to you a little bit about my brother and my mom. Have I? Mm-hmm. Over the past year and a half? Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, all right, depression, anger, bargaining, guilt. For me, maybe each one of us has our own different. I don't necessarily get angry, like I get frustrated, but for me, it's guilt, and I eventually want to get into this idea of perspective. But it's guilt in that how I am to that person, how I have been to that person, how you take things for granted, you don't understand, but there's that thing of perspective. And I remember learning that for the first time. I had a dog when I was young, and he lived till he was almost 16, and it was like my best friend. And as he was dying, he lost control of his spine and his back half, and it was just this, probably a couple month process of him dying. And after he passed, even like, every once in a while now, I'll think about it, like I would feel so guilty for getting frustrated at him for not being able to do something. Be like, come on, just walk, and it like just killed me. And so I guess when you're interacting with people going through those things, you mentioned the anger, you're kind of a little bit, like let them be angry. Don't, push the button anymore. Is there like a strategy, any additional ideas or insights for us, people who are listening, in grieving or allowing others to grieve, that you've seen play out? Like whether it's with guilt, whether it's depression, is it always a hands off? Is sometime it probing, asking questions, getting to see where they're at, what they want to talk about? Like what's a delicate or etiquette way to handle that?
Well, and the thing is that with grieving, it's never labeled. I am now going through anger. And I know that, just a little example. So bereavement can happen over a multitude of things, not just people dying, losing a job, losing an animal, losing a situation in life. Like those are all things that we can grieve over. So I think what happens is that when we begin to grieve, as I said, there's never a label. An example of that is at one point, the company that I worked for sold out and another company came in. And that was a real bereavement to me. That was a big loss to me. I loved the other company, and the other company it did not come up to standards as far as I was concerned. And I never thought of it as a bereavement type of thing. And so I started getting very angry. It wasn't necessarily angry at the situation. It was just anger to whoever walked in the door, particularly my poor husband at the brunt of it. And suddenly then it dawned on me, no, wait a minute, I'm going through bereavement. So sometimes making somebody aware that what they're feeling is, you know what, you're really not angry at me, or you're really not angry at that person. It's an emotion that you're experiencing because of what you're experiencing. So there can be times where there's like I said with my daughter, it was just a gentle reminder, you know what, this is part of the bereavement process and it's okay. And then once she saw that, she's like, oh, I get it. Because a lot of times I think when you go through the bereavement and you start to feel these emotions, you feel out of control because you don't know where they're coming from. Like the guilt that you were talking about. You felt bad that you were yelling at the dog, but you're like, well, why I feel so out of control that I'm like yelling at this poor dog. And I think if somebody would have come along and said, you know what, it's part of the grieving process. And you'll be okay. And it's okay to feel that because it is so human for you to be feeling that during that process. I think it gives the person freedom, and I think it gives them control.
And it also just gave me freedom from you saying that. Like, and it happened so many years ago, but it's like, it is reassuring to hear that because I feel like a giant a-hole for that.
Right. And you feel out of control when you're going, where's this coming from? But I still feel it. It does put you back in control.
And then segueing that, and I want to get into a little bit of the logistical care, right? I know I had asked you what's the difference between palliative and hospice, and I want to get into that eventually, but so dealing with everything my family's dealing with, and my brother and my mom, and my mom's essentially back to normal, but it is autoimmune disease. So, viruses are more, dangerous than had she not an autoimmune disease. So it's not like she's out of the blue. but one of the things that I it's this flux of perspective, being shaken, being brought back to what's really important, and then time distancing you away from what's really important, right? So whenever we would go to Pittsburgh, and now it's Houston for treatment, for either one, nothing else mattered. It was such a not fun place to be, yet such a valuable, meaningful place to be. Nothing mattered. Stupid podcast doesn't matter. Stupid emails doesn't matter. Whatever. You're here for a purpose, right? This is life. But then a day, 2 days, a week, 2 weeks, 2 months, then a new norm develops. Mm-hmm. And then I'm trying to get this mastery of not distancing yourself from that perspective, like not distancing from yourself from what's really important. So my question to you is, do you think that's possible? And having been in hospice, talking about the process of death and dying so much, are you more in the present moment? Like, has it affected you such that you're more in the present moment, not distancing yourself too far away from what's important in life? Or is that just a natural process that we've got to fight every single day of our lives to not get too far from that?
Yeah. Just a key word is, one day at a time. And it's dealing with that day that we've only been given one day. Nobody is assured tomorrow. We're not even assured the next minute, but we are assured this minute. So it is living in the moment and making the most of that moment. And yeah, we don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. We don't know if that person's going to be here tomorrow. We don't even know we're going to be here tomorrow. But I think that's the important thing, is learning, particularly when you're dealing with somebody who is in the dying process. Because I remember caregiving for people and think, is this the day? Is this the day today? One particular gentleman that I think of, he had a lung disease, and every day I would go there and I would think, is this the day? And, choosing to live that day with him to the fullest, because I didn't know if I was going to see him tomorrow. And I think you do get that perspective when you are dealing with people that are dying all the time. Is this the last time I'm going to go in and see them? And to make that as special as it is. And yeah, we live life. We're going to get caught up in the things that we get caught up in, but that's what that day is bringing you. When the day brings you your podcast, you're going to put your all into it because that's what you have. When the day comes for you to be with your brother or your mom, that's what you focus on. So it's a day by day thing, I think, is the most important thing to remember.
Yeah, and I think that's a great answer, because as I said, a day and then a week. Well, if you never get out of the day, then you don't distance yourself from what's really important. And that's like, whenever students ask me questions about getting through tough times, sometimes the sad truth is I heard this saying, but it's the sentiment of it, like, the only way through is through. That's it. Right. Like, that's it. How? Well, you do day to day. Right. And then can you lay out for people, I didn't know this, and maybe other people do, maybe other people don't, but the difference between, I know definitely, like, the terms palliative care and hospice. And if there's any other nomenclature that I'm not saying right now, but I had to learn I think I specifically asked you, hey, what's the difference of this and that? So could you kind of lay out those definitions?
Sure. So palliative care is basically taking care of a person who's uncomfortable and making them comfortable. So they could have a diagnosis of maybe, I'm just trying to think of something, maybe leukemia. And so that leukemia, especially if certain leukemias will last for years. My brother has leukemia. He's had it for 25 years. So palliative care is making him comfortable. He does do chemotherapy. He does some other types of forms of that the possibility is that he can get better or that he can maintain a normal lifestyle. So he would be under palliative care. In other words, they would still be doing maybe some kind of experimental drugs. They would be doing chemotherapy. They would be doing maybe some physical therapy. So anything in order to make that person comfortable and possibly heal their disease. Hospice is when somebody has 6 to 8 months of a diagnosis to live and they decide that they are not going to pursue anything else. So people that are on hospice are not taking chemotherapy. They're not taking any kind of experimental drugs to heal whatever disease that they have that's bringing them to the end of life. They will, so to be on hospice, they have to say, we're done with everything. I'm ready to die. Now, some people on hospice can live a lot longer. One of the things that we're seeing a lot is patients with dementia. It's very hard to call the last days of dementia. So there are some people that can be on hospice for a year and a half. But during that year and a half, every 2 weeks, they must be declining in some way because all the hospice team gets together, talks about that patient and say, yes, I see that they're deteriorating in X, Y, and Z, so they can stay on hospice, but they must be always going on a downward slant, where palliative care can be going on a plateau or can actually be getting better.
And you jogged my memory when you were talking about that, and it's a connection from the book Being Mortal, but then also during our sessions together, because we watched, I believe it was a video. It was an older woman who I believe had dementia, and it had something to do with music, and kind of maybe she wasn't speaking and music like. And you can fill in the details, but what I remember from it is older woman with dementia, music essentially bringing her back to life or giving her some life. In the book, they talk about it must have been a nursing home, people with dementia, and them bringing in pets and plants and life and people like this is the mystery of people, right? That like how the heck do we work? You know, like someone getting basically like berated by their daughter that they might not have been the best father to, and then saying, okay, that's it, and then passing, or like your brother telling your dad, we're not going to do skits, and you know him passing. It's like, wow, it's just mind blowing. It's a mystery. It's a miracle. But talk about that example, because again, like thinking of COVID, and I'm not on a mission and I don't have an agenda. I just like to try to think objectively about everything. And it was my neighbor saying, because we were talking about this and people dying alone, they're both nurses. And she said, well, if you're interested in that, you should read this book, Being Mortal. And in the book, he talks about, you know, the pets and the plants, et cetera, giving people a purpose, a meaning. So talk about that, if you remember specifically that example, and then if not specifically, that idea.
I do remember that example because that is actually one of my passions, is this idea of music and the brain, particularly end of life, particularly dementia. So what you were referring to was there's a video called Alive Inside, and it is a gentleman in New York City who started doing experimental work with music and dementia patients. Some with early onstart dementia, you know, those that start in their 40s. And then he also took it to nursing homes for people that were older. And it was incredible to watch people. There's particularly one older gentleman who is sitting in his wheelchair. He's totally unresponsive. She comes along, she puts these earphones in, and she's got a little, you know, just a little iPod that she's playing. And and he literally comes alive. He's able to have a conversation. He's able to talk about some memories that he had in the past. He's able to start singing some songs. And it just is amazing the way that this music can reach down into the soul and draw these people back out again. And, you know, and pets are another one, as you said. Pet therapy is a huge, it's just a huge therapy that can bring a person who is feeling alone, because animals are so accepting. Animals are just so loving, and they're just so willing to like love on anybody that's going to love on them. And I've seen the results of volunteers taking in pets to a nursing home and just absolutely coming alive with just petting them, and just loving them and just having that one-on-one, just that love relationship that pets are so willing to give. But music and dementia is just absolutely incredible. Another quick story, it was a story of a woman who, she was in a nursing home and the son was sitting beside her, and the gentleman came along and put the ear pods on, and started playing some big band sounds, and she took off well, before that, let me back up a little bit. So the son was sitting there, and they asked the lady, well, who is this beside you? And she's like, I know you're not my husband. I know you're, I don't know. I don't know who it is. Put the music on. She listened to it for maybe about 10 minutes, took it off, and had a conversation with her son. And he's crying because it's like the first time that he was able to have a conversation with his mom as his mom. And it was just so
So
cool.
cool.
Yeah.
And what is that? You said it's a passion of yours, so I would imagine you experienced it, studied it, learned about it. Like, what do you? I mean, either do you know what it is, or what is your intuition that causes that? Like, what do you think?
I think music gets down to our soul. I think it reaches down to our soul, and the soul never dies. So to be able to put that music in and to draw that soul back out again, that's what I think.
I heard someone one time, and it makes perfect sense. In alignment with your beliefs, and in alignment with your peace, and that it's a perfect answer to that question, to be honest. But I heard someone one time talk about art and music, saying it really doesn't make sense. Like it's not a necessity. It's not a I don't know. It's just a thing, right? But it speaks to us in a way that other things don't speak to us. So it's almost like a mystery, and it's even confusing for me to explain. But it's a thing that isn't necessary, but is super valuable and has such a profound impact
Hmm.
on us
I've,
as
I've,
people.
I've even seen people that, on videos, I've seen people that have had walking issues because of dementia, and they put music on and they started waltzing. I mean, that's just incredible that just connection can happen.
It's awesome. And then talk a little bit about more kind of coming to the third quarter, I think, of the conversation, but talk about the logistics, the options, logistics. You mentioned the difference between palliative care and hospice. There's decisions that people have to make, and things they have to take care of, in death and dying. So in whatever direction you want to take it, whether it's the process of where does hospice take place? Is it in a hospital? Is it at home? Is it in a facility? And then some of the other like things that have to be taken care of when you get to that point.
So hospice they will go into anywhere where somebody's dying. So they will go into your home, they will go into a nursing home, and they will go into hospitals. So with a hospital, hospitals are mainly for comfort measures. So that the hospice would be the one who would be in control of all the pain medication. Usually if somebody's in the hospital, they're at the point where they maybe have 24 to 48 hours left of their life. So hospice will come in and will dose them more times than not with morphine, just so that they're comfortable. So they do go into the hospitals, very short stays in a hospital. Like I said, it's usually only a day or two that the hospital will then call and have hospice come in. They do go into nursing homes and they will take care of a person in a nursing home. Basically the same thing. What they will be responsible for is for that person's, they'll have aides that will come in and will take care of that patient. They'll bathe them, change any bandages that need to be changed. And then the nurse will come in and she will be the one responsible for the pain medication for that patient. And then in the home, basically the same thing. The aides will go in and they'll do a variety of things, maybe some light housekeeping, maybe keeping the caregiver company, because sometimes, the caregiver just needs somebody to talk to. And then once again, the nurse will go in and they're the ones that are responsible for pain medication, making sure that it's working. They're the ones that will be in contact with the doctors to make sure that everything is happening. A lot of times when people are on hospice, they'll begin to come off some of their other drugs. That's usually something that will happen. So if they're on heart medication, what hospice is interested in, their main goal is for that person to be comfortable during the dying process. So if that medication is basically keeping them alive, they will remove that. Now, not without that person's choice. But if it's something that's usually keeping them alive and they choose to stay on that medication, they will usually not be on hospice. So that's something that, a good conversation to have. Are you willing to come off all this medication? Now, like I said, some medications they will stay on because they're there for comfort measures. Logistically, I'm not really the one to talk about the logistics of things. Obviously, you want to make sure that you have your financials in order, that you have your wills in order. One thing that I would say is to make sure that you have somebody who is going to take care of your will, and that you are, and I'm drawing a blank at the name right now. Oh, your power of attorney. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that your power of attorney is somebody that you do trust explicitly. There are different powers of attorney. There's a power of attorney that will just deal with your medical issues, so they cannot touch your finances. But then there are powers of attorney that you can give to your finances, and then there's a power of attorney that you can give to your all over health, all over being. So your power of attorney can basically go in and tell everybody what to do when you become incapable of speaking for yourself. So you want to make sure that your power of attorney is on the exact same page as you, with a living will, for instance. We had a situation, it was such a sad situation. The mother had dementia, the daughter had power of attorney, the daughter did not want to let the mom go. And so she kept trying to do all these various and sundry, very evasive processes in order to keep her mom alive. And it was just so sad, because that's not what the mom wanted. And the mom would talk to us, but she wouldn't talk to her daughter. So that is one thing that I always tell people, please, please, please make sure, number one, if you are a power of attorney of somebody, that you know their wishes exactly and you're willing to stand by them. If you're not, then find somebody else to be the power of attorney. And the same thing goes for if you have a power of attorney, make sure that they understand your wishes explicitly and they're willing to follow through with them. So that's what I would say as far as the logistic part.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. And again, it's really it is uncomfortable, but if you talk about it, it is what it is, right? It's just a part of life. And I think this was an education, prior working with you was an education, and this was an education. And for people who, there's the gamut here. There's people who have experienced death at a young age and have had to deal with it their entire lives. People who, I'm relatively fortunate. My grandma passed away when I was 10 or 11, and like that was the first, and there's not been too many traumatic experiences since then, and there's people who are skating by, but it is certainly a part of life. So I just appreciate your time, your openness to shed some light on something that we don't talk about often, and give you a time here to impart any last thoughts or final considerations for people.
Yeah, I would just say don't be afraid, and don't avoid the person because they are dying. That's one of the things we think, oh, I just don't know what to say. Just be yourself. Just be who you are. Just let that person be who they are. Don't look at the disease, but look at the person. And so that would be my final word, is just to treat them like you did before they were even sick.
Perfect. Thanks so much for your time, Jill.
Oh, my pleasure.